The flickering screens that illuminate American homes each evening cast more than mere light, they project moral darkness into the very soul of our civilization. What passes for entertainment today would have horrified our ancestors, yet we consume it with the casual indifference of a society that has forgotten the permanent things. From my years observing the decay of moral imagination in American culture, I have witnessed how Hollywood's machinery transforms noble human aspirations into base appetites, reducing the complexity of human experience to crude formulas of sensation and sentiment. The entertainment industry operates not merely as a business, but as a seminary of secular ideology, teaching millions of Americans to worship false gods of materialism, hedonism, and egalitarian fantasy. Where once our culture drew its moral instruction from scripture, literature, and the accumulated wisdom of ages, we now permit California's dream merchants to shape our understanding of right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, sacred and profane. This represents more than aesthetic corruption. It constitutes a fundamental assault on the moral order that sustains free society. When a civilization loses its capacity to distinguish between noble and base entertainment, between art that elevates and spectacle that degrades, it signals the approaching collapse of cultural authority itself. Tonight, we shall examine how Hollywood's influence undermines the very foundations upon which American order depends. Chapter 1: The Moral Imagination Under Siege. What I have long called the moral imagination, that capacity to perceive ethical truth through story, symbol, and metaphor, suffers systematic assault from Hollywood's relentless production of moral confusion. The entertainment industry operates on the premise that traditional distinctions between virtue and vice are obsolete prejudices, that moral complexity can be reduced to psychological explanations, and that redemption comes not through sacrifice and grace but through self-assertion and therapeutic validation. Consider how contemporary films and television programs systematically invert moral categories. The criminal becomes the hero whose violence we are taught to admire. The traditional family appears as a source of oppression requiring liberation. Religious faith emerges as either fanatical extremism or quaint delusion. Authority figures, fathers, teachers, clergy, soldiers, appear consistently as either incompetent buffoons or sinister oppressors. This is not accidental artistic choice but deliberate ideological conditioning. Where classical art once taught audiences to recognize nobility, courage, and sacrifice as truly admirable qualities, Hollywood's productions cultivate cynicism toward all claims of higher purpose. The very notion that human beings might aspire to transcendent ideals becomes the object of sophisticated mockery. We are encouraged instead to celebrate the antihero, to find conventional morality hypocritical, and to embrace rebellion against traditional authority as the highest form of authenticity. This corruption of moral imagination proves particularly devastating because it operates below the threshold of conscious thought. Young people absorb these inverted moral categories before they possess the intellectual equipment to critique them. They learn to associate traditional virtue with repression and vice with freedom, without ever examining the philosophical assumptions underlying these associations. The consequences extend far beyond entertainment preference. When moral imagination becomes corrupted, citizens lose the capacity to recognize genuine nobility when it appears in political life. They become susceptible to demagogues who promise liberation from traditional restraints while leading them toward new forms of bondage. A people whose moral imagination has been systematically degraded cannot sustain the self-government that free institutions require. Consider the stark contrast between the entertainment our grandparents consumed and what floods our screens today. Where their films celebrated duty, honor, and sacrifice, ours glorify self-indulgence, cynicism, and the destruction of inherited wisdom. This represents more than changing artistic fashion. It signals a civilization teaching its children to despise the very values that made their freedom possible. Chapter 2: The Cult of Immediate Gratification. Hollywood's fundamental business model depends upon stimulating and satisfying immediate appetites rather than cultivating long-term character formation. The industry has perfected techniques for delivering instant emotional payoffs through violence, sexual excitement, and sensational spectacle, training audiences to expect constant stimulation and to reject the patient discipline that genuine culture requires. Traditional entertainment, whether classical drama, folk tales, or religious pageantry, operated on entirely different principles. These forms demanded active intellectual and emotional engagement from audiences. They required patience, contemplation, and the willingness to discover meaning through careful attention to narrative development. Most importantly, they aimed at moral instruction, seeking to elevate human consciousness toward higher purposes. Modern entertainment reverses these priorities completely. Rather than asking audiences to stretch their imaginative and moral capacities, it reduces complex human experiences to simplified formulas designed for rapid consumption. Plot development accelerates to maintain constant excitement. Character development becomes subordinate to spectacular action sequences. Moral complexity disappears in favor of emotional manipulation designed to produce immediate satisfaction. This transformation reflects broader cultural changes that I have observed throughout my lifetime. American society increasingly organizes itself around the principle of immediate gratification rather than deferred satisfaction. We expect instant results in every sphere of life, from career advancement to romantic relationships to spiritual fulfillment. Hollywood both reflects and reinforces this destructive orientation. The entertainment industry's addiction to novelty proves equally corrosive to cultural stability. Each season demands more extreme content to capture audience attention jaded by previous successes. Violence becomes more graphic, sexuality more explicit, language more crude, and moral transgression more celebrated. This escalating spiral of sensationalism reflects not artistic innovation but the desperate pursuit of shock value in a marketplace where traditional sources of dramatic interest have been abandoned. Consider how this dynamic affects family life. Parents struggle to protect children from entertainment content that would have been inconceivable in earlier generations, while simultaneously competing with production budgets of millions of dollars designed to capture young attention. Traditional family activities, conversation, reading, outdoor recreation, religious observance, cannot match the artificial excitement of electronic entertainment. The long-term consequences prove devastating for character formation. Young people raised on entertainment that provides constant stimulation develop shortened attention spans, diminished capacity for solitary reflection, and expectation that all worthwhile activities should provide immediate pleasure. They become psychologically incapable of the sustained effort that genuine achievement requires in any sphere of human endeavor. This cultivation of immediate gratification undermines the moral foundations of free society, which depends upon citizens capable of sacrificing short-term pleasure for long-term good. When entertainment trains entire generations to expect instant satisfaction, democratic institutions that require patient civic engagement become increasingly difficult to sustain. Chapter 3: Tradition as Democracy of the Dead. The entertainment industry's systematic ridicule of traditional wisdom represents a particularly insidious form of cultural vandalism. Hollywood consistently portrays inherited customs, religious practices, and social conventions as obstacles to human fulfillment rather than as repositories of accumulated wisdom tested by centuries of human experience. This rejection of tradition amounts to the disenfranchisement of our ancestors, what I have called the democracy of the dead. When filmmakers consistently portray traditional family structures as oppressive, religious belief as ignorant, and conventional morality as hypocritical, they teach audiences to dismiss the moral insights of countless generations who struggled to understand how human beings might live together in harmony. This represents more than artistic preference, it constitutes cultural suicide, the deliberate abandonment of wisdom purchased through centuries of trial and error. Consider how Hollywood treats the institution of marriage. Rather than presenting matrimony as a sacred covenant that channels sexual energy toward the formation of stable families and the rearing of children, contemporary entertainment portrays marriage as an arbitrary social convention that constrains individual autonomy. Divorce becomes liberation, adultery becomes authentic self-expression, and commitment becomes an outdated constraint on personal growth. This treatment ignores the accumulated wisdom of human experience regarding the conditions necessary for stable family formation. Traditional marriage customs developed not as arbitrary restrictions but as practical solutions to perennial human problems. They represent our ancestors' hard-won insights into how sexual relationships might be ordered to serve both individual flourishing and social stability. Similar patterns appear in Hollywood's treatment of religious tradition. Rather than presenting faith as a source of moral guidance and spiritual comfort tested by millennia of human experience, entertainment typically portrays religion as either dangerous fanaticism or therapeutic delusion. The possibility that religious traditions might contain genuine wisdom about human nature and moral order rarely receives serious consideration. This systematic devaluation of traditional wisdom leaves young people spiritually defenseless against the ideological currents of their time. Deprived of access to the moral resources of the past, they become easy targets for contemporary fashions that promise liberation but deliver new forms of bondage. They lack the historical perspective necessary to distinguish between genuine moral progress and mere change. The consequences extend far beyond individual choice. When a civilization loses respect for the wisdom of its ancestors, it loses the capacity for self-correction that stable societies require. Each generation must rediscover basic truths about human nature and social order that previous generations had already learned, wasting enormous energy on problems that tradition had already solved. True cultural health requires what Edmund Burke called a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Hollywood's entertainment culture breaks this partnership by teaching the living to despise the dead and to ignore their obligations to the unborn. This temporal chauvinism, the assumption that current fashions represent the pinnacle of human wisdom, leads inevitably to cultural decline and social disintegration. The preservation of civilized order requires institutions that transmit traditional wisdom from one generation to the next. When entertainment media systematically undermine this transmission, they attack the very foundations upon which free society depends. Chapter 4: The Transcendent Order Under Attack. Perhaps no aspect of Hollywood's cultural influence proves more destructive than its systematic assault on belief in transcendent order, the understanding that human existence derives meaning from participation in a reality greater than immediate material experience. The entertainment industry operates from thoroughly secular assumptions, treating religious faith as primitive superstition and reducing human significance to purely material and psychological categories. This materialistic worldview permeates contemporary entertainment in ways both obvious and subtle. Obvious examples include films that explicitly mock religious belief or portray clergy as either charlatans or fanatics. More subtle but equally corrosive is the general assumption that human problems find solutions through purely secular means, therapy, political action, technological innovation, or personal self-assertion, rather than through spiritual transformation and submission to divine authority. The absence of genuine religious sensibility in mainstream entertainment reflects broader cultural changes that I have observed throughout my lifetime. American society increasingly operates as if transcendent reality does not exist, as if human beings are merely sophisticated animals whose highest aspirations involve material comfort and psychological satisfaction. This spiritual impoverishment appears clearly in entertainment that can imagine no higher purpose for human existence than the pursuit of individual pleasure and the avoidance of suffering. Consider how contemporary films and television programs handle questions of ultimate meaning. When characters face genuine moral crises, They typically resolve their dilemmas through purely humanistic reasoning rather than through appeal to transcendent moral law. Death appears as simple biological termination rather than as transition to eternal judgment. Suffering serves no redemptive purpose but represents only meaningless accident requiring therapeutic intervention. This systematic exclusion of transcendent perspective deprives entertainment of its capacity to address the deepest human concerns. Great art throughout history has drawn its power from the recognition that human existence participates in cosmic drama extending far beyond immediate material circumstances. When entertainment loses this vertical dimension, it becomes incapable of producing the genuine catharsis that allows audiences to confront life's most profound challenges. The entertainment industry's hostility to transcendent order also manifests in its treatment of moral authority. Traditional sources of ethical guidance, scripture, religious teaching, inherited wisdom, appear consistently as obstacles to human fulfillment rather than as means of discovering life's genuine purpose. Characters who submit to higher authority typically appear as either weak-minded followers or dangerous fanatics, while those who assert autonomous individual judgment receive celebration as authentic heroes. This celebration of moral autonomy reflects the deeper philosophical error that underlies much contemporary entertainment. The assumption that individual human reason, unguided by tradition or transcendent revelation, can discover reliable moral truth ignores both the limitations of human understanding and the corrupting influence of self-interest on moral judgment. History demonstrates repeatedly that societies that reject transcendent moral authority inevitably descend into tyranny or anarchy. The practical consequences of this spiritual impoverishment appear throughout American society. Rising rates of suicide, depression, and substance abuse reflect in part the loss of transcendent meaning that secular entertainment both reflects and reinforces. When people lose connection to purposes greater than immediate satisfaction, life becomes meaningless burden rather than sacred trust. Young people prove particularly vulnerable to this spiritual emptiness. Raised on entertainment that recognizes no authority higher than individual preference, they lack the moral resources necessary to resist destructive impulses or to find meaning in sacrifice and service. They become psychologically dependent on external stimulation for any sense of significance, making them easy targets for political demagogues and commercial manipulation. Chapter 5: Egalitarian Fantasy and Natural Hierarchy. The entertainment industry serves as one of modern America's most effective propagandists for egalitarian ideology, consistently promoting the fantasy that all human differences reflect arbitrary social construction rather than natural variation in talent, character, and calling. This systematic denial of natural hierarchy undermines both individual flourishing and social stability by encouraging expectations that reality cannot satisfy. Hollywood's egalitarian messaging appears most obviously in its treatment of social class, gender roles, and cultural differences. Films and television programs routinely suggest that all social distinctions result from oppression rather than from legitimate differences in achievement, virtue, or contribution to common good. The possibility that hierarchies might reflect natural variation in human capacities or might serve beneficial social functions rarely receives serious consideration. Consider how contemporary entertainment handles differences in intellectual ability. Rather than acknowledging that human beings possess varying capacities for abstract thought, artistic creation, or practical problem solving, popular culture typically portrays academic or cultural achievement as either irrelevant pretension or disguised oppression. The scholar appears as an impractical fool, the artist as a neurotic eccentric, and the person of genuine cultivation as an elitist snob. This systematic devaluation of excellence reflects the deeper egalitarian assumption that all claims to superior achievement mask illegitimate attempts to maintain social privilege. The entertainment industry operates from the premise that genuine merit cannot exist because all human differences result from environmental advantages rather than natural endowment or personal effort. Similar patterns appear in Hollywood's treatment of traditional gender roles. Rather than recognizing that men and women possess complementary strengths and natural tendencies that serve different but equally valuable social functions, contemporary entertainment presents all gender distinctions as arbitrary social constructions designed to maintain male dominance. The possibility that differentiated roles might reflect biological reality or serve beneficial social purposes becomes literally unthinkable within this ideological framework. The consequences of this egalitarian fantasy extend far beyond entertainment preference. When young people receive constant cultural messages that all human differences are illegitimate, they develop unrealistic expectations about what life owes them. They expect equal outcomes regardless of unequal efforts, equal recognition regardless of unequal achievements, and equal authority regardless of unequal wisdom or experience. These expectations prove particularly destructive in educational institutions, where students increasingly resist the natural hierarchy between teacher and pupil. When entertainment teaches children that all claims to superior knowledge represent oppressive power assertions, they become psychologically incapable of the intellectual humility that genuine learning requires. The entertainment industry's promotion of egalitarian ideology also undermines appreciation for the division of labor that complex societies require. Rather than celebrating the diverse contributions that different types of people make to common welfare, popular culture suggests that all roles possess equal dignity and importance. This message, however well-intentioned, ignores the obvious reality that some social functions require greater skill, involve greater responsibility, or contribute more significantly to general prosperity. True social health requires what I call equality in inequality, the recognition that human beings possess equal dignity as children of God while acknowledging their unequal talents, achievements, and social contributions. This understanding allows society to honor genuine excellence while maintaining compassion for those of more modest abilities. The egalitarian fantasy promoted by Hollywood destroys this delicate balance by teaching people to resent rather than respect legitimate differences in human capacity and achievement. The result is social envy, political resentment, and the systematic destruction of institutions that depend upon natural hierarchy for their proper functioning. Chapter 6: Ideological Radicalism versus Political Prudence. The entertainment industry functions as an especially effective vehicle for ideological radicalism, promoting sweeping social transformations based on abstract theories rather than the gradual, prudent reforms that preserve social stability while correcting genuine abuses. Hollywood consistently portrays radical activism as heroic while presenting defenders of established institutions as either villainous oppressors or cowardly conformists. This celebration of radicalism reflects the broader modern tendency to approach social problems through ideological abstraction rather than practical wisdom accumulated through experience. Contemporary entertainment operates from the assumption that existing social arrangements result from historical accident or deliberate oppression rather than from organic development shaped by human nature and practical necessity. Consider how films and television programs typically handle social reform movements. Rather than examining the complex interplay between necessary change and valuable continuity, popular entertainment presents social transformation as simple conflict between progressive heroes fighting for justice and reactionary villains defending privilege. This melodramatic framework ignores the genuine difficulty of distinguishing between needed reforms and destructive innovations. The entertainment industry's treatment of political activism reveals similar ideological bias. Characters who challenge established authority through dramatic confrontation receive sympathetic portrayal, while those who work for gradual improvement through existing institutions appear as either ineffective moderates or corrupt collaborators. The possibility that prudent reform might require patience, compromise, and respect for legitimate competing interests rarely receives serious consideration. This systematic promotion of radical activism proves particularly dangerous because it operates through emotional manipulation rather than rational argument. Young viewers absorb revolutionary attitudes before they possess the historical knowledge necessary to evaluate the consequences of radical social transformation. They learn to identify moral worth with opposition to existing institutions rather than with the harder task of preserving what deserves preservation while carefully changing what requires correction. The entertainment industry's celebration of radicalism also reflects its fundamental misunderstanding of how beneficial social change actually occurs. Real improvement typically results from the gradual accumulation of small reforms that build upon existing foundations rather than from revolutionary attempts to reconstruct society according to abstract blueprints. The most successful social movements in American history, including the abolition of slavery and the extension of political rights, succeeded precisely because they appealed to established principles rather than rejecting inherited wisdom entirely. Hollywood's ideological bias becomes especially apparent in its treatment of conservative characters and viewpoints. Defenders of traditional institutions consistently appear as either ignorant bigots or sinister manipulators, while the possibility that conservative arguments might reflect genuine wisdom about human nature and social order receives no serious consideration. This systematic exclusion of conservative perspectives from sympathetic portrayal represents cultural propaganda rather than artistic expression. The practical consequences of this ideological indoctrination appear throughout American political life. Citizens raised on entertainment that celebrates radical activism develop unrealistic expectations about the pace and scope of social change. They become impatient with the slow processes of democratic deliberation and constitutional government, preferring dramatic gestures to patient institution building. This radicalization of popular attitudes undermines the political prudence that free government requires. Democratic institutions depend upon citizens capable of distinguishing between necessary reforms and destructive innovations, between legitimate grievances and utopian fantasies. When entertainment systematically promotes radical solutions to complex social problems, it erodes the careful judgment that constitutional government presupposes. The entertainment industry's promotion of ideological thinking also encourages the dangerous tendency to reduce complex social questions to simple moral categories. Rather than recognizing that most political issues involve legitimate competing values and interests, popular culture teaches audiences to approach public questions as battles between absolute good and absolute evil. This moralization of politics destroys the capacity for compromise and accommodation that democratic societies require. When citizens view political opponents as moral enemies rather than fellow Americans with different but potentially legitimate concerns, constitutional government becomes impossible to sustain. Chapter 7: Defending the Permanent Things. Against Hollywood's assault on moral order stands the eternal task of preserving what I have called the permanent things, those moral and spiritual truths that transcend temporal fashion and provide stable foundation for human flourishing across generations. The entertainment industry's corruption of American culture, however extensive, cannot ultimately destroy these eternal verities, though it can temporarily obscure their recognition by confused generations. The permanent things include humanity's inherent dignity as beings created in the divine image, the existence of objective moral law that judges all human actions, the necessity of ordered liberty that balances freedom with responsibility, the wisdom embodied in inherited traditions, and the transcendent purpose that gives meaning to temporal existence. These truths survive all attempts at cultural manipulation because they reflect the fundamental structure of reality rather than human preference or social construction. The preservation of permanent things requires active resistance to the cultural corruption that emanates from Hollywood and similar sources. This resistance cannot take the form of mere reaction or nostalgic retreat into an imagined past, but must involve the creative application of eternal principles to contemporary challenges. Each generation faces the responsibility of discovering how timeless truths apply to the particular circumstances of their historical moment. In practical terms, defending the permanent things against entertainment industry corruption requires several specific commitments. First, We must cultivate discriminating taste that distinguishes between art that elevates human consciousness and spectacle that degrades it. This discrimination requires education in the great works of Western civilization that exemplify moral imagination at its finest, the plays of Shakespeare, the novels of Dickens, the poetry of Eliot, the musical compositions of Bach. Second, we must create alternative institutions that transmit cultural wisdom independent of commercial entertainment. These include schools that provide genuine liberal education, churches that maintain traditional worship and moral teaching, family traditions that connect children to their heritage, and community organizations that foster civic virtue rather than merely providing amusement. Third, we must engage in the patient work of cultural renewal that seeks to restore moral imagination to its proper place in American life. This requires supporting artists and writers who understand their vocation as service to transcendent beauty rather than mere personal expression, encouraging educational institutions that prioritize wisdom over technical training, and defending religious liberty against secular attempts to privatize spiritual truth. The defense of permanent things also requires intellectual courage to challenge prevailing cultural assumptions even when such challenges invite ridicule or persecution. Those who understand the importance of transcendent order must be willing to appear old-fashioned, narrow-minded, or intolerant in the eyes of those who mistake moral confusion for sophistication. Most importantly, preserving the permanent things requires personal commitment to live according to eternal principles regardless of cultural pressure to conform to contemporary fashion. This means choosing entertainment that elevates rather than degrades, raising children according to traditional wisdom rather than progressive theory, and organizing one's life around transcendent purposes rather than immediate pleasure. The ultimate source of hope in this cultural struggle lies in the recognition that permanent things possess inherent power that no human institution can permanently suppress. Truth, beauty, and goodness exercise their own attraction that survives temporary cultural confusion. Each generation includes individuals who recognize the inadequacy of secular materialism and seek connection to higher reality. These seekers provide the foundation for cultural renewal that preserves civilized order across historical transitions. They serve as guardians of wisdom during periods of cultural darkness and as agents of restoration when conditions permit genuine reform. Their faithfulness to permanent things ensures the continuity of human civilization despite temporary setbacks and apparent defeats. The entertainment industry's current dominance over American culture represents one such temporary setback rather than permanent victory. Like all human institutions based on false premises, Hollywood's empire of moral confusion contains the seeds of its own destruction. Its productions grow increasingly desperate and extreme as audiences become jaded by previous excesses, while its message of meaningless materialism fails to satisfy genuine human needs for transcendent purpose and moral order. Conclusion. The battle for America's soul extends far beyond politics into the realm of imagination, where entertainment shapes the moral sensibilities of entire generations. Hollywood's systematic corruption of moral imagination represents one of the gravest threats to the survival of free institutions. Yet this threat contains within itself the possibility of cultural renewal for those wise enough to recognize permanent things. The entertainment industry's power, however extensive, ultimately depends upon our voluntary submission to its influence. When we choose authentic culture over commercial spectacle, when we cultivate traditional wisdom over contemporary fashion, when we organize our lives around transcendent purposes rather than immediate pleasure, we begin the patient work of cultural restoration. This restoration requires neither nostalgia for an imagined past nor acceptance of an impoverished present, but rather the creative application of eternal principles to contemporary challenges. The permanent things provide reliable foundation for this work because they reflect the fundamental structure of reality rather than temporary human preference. The task before us demands intellectual courage, moral imagination, and patient persistence. We must become guardians of cultural wisdom during this period of confusion while preparing for the eventual restoration that historical experience suggests will surely come. In this great work, we serve not only our own generation but all future Americans who deserve to inherit the full richness of Western civilization.